ReD, Book 1, The Dark Pale Perspective. Chapter 11, Security. The shipping container was just for show, a facade that always brought a smile to Remy Hannington's face as he stepped inside and flicked on the lights with a remote control. A remote control run within an application on his customized smartphone. He had his own independent cell tower not far from the crate he called home. The cell tower wasn't exactly off the grid, it was just a different grid, an independent one, and one of many that the general population weren't currently aware of. An incident involving Remy years earlier had warranted the creation of these new, separate grids. The fact of the matter was that only one person, or set of people, are able to use certain radio frequencies at any one time. If you were to go into your car, turn on the radio and listen to whatever station was transmitting on 163.5, for example, whether it be music or other forms of entertainment, you would be able to listen to whatever was on that radio frequency, because it can only be used by that specific radio station. If Remy was to try and transmit on 163.5, close to the radio station's location, he may have been able to overpower that frequency, but it would, in turn, knock out the station originally being heard on 163.5. It was, in fact, always the way Remy described the most simplistic definition of jamming. The problem is, in addition to the first problem, is that if everyone was allowed to use whatever frequency they felt like using 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, people would be, more than likely unwittingly, jamming everybody else who wanted to use that frequency at the same time. The result, our modern communication system falls apart. It just falls apart. So, many essential devices in this generation are designed to work off of radio waves. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, therefore decided, along with Congress, a couple of decades earlier, after learning of the multiple advantages that came with GPS location technology, as opposed to the inaccurate and simple home address, that they would auction off specific frequencies to multiple companies in certain geographic areas. An example, multiple companies could own the frequency 163.5, but they would have to be far enough apart so that the two companies aren't interfering with one another. Multiple army units could be using the same frequency for multiple roles, but only if the two units are serving in two totally different parts of the country, for example. Remy's most common problem when he started leading this double life, doing things that he would never be proud of, was making sure he himself wasn't being accidentally jammed. One example, Remy attempted to set off a small explosive inside a building specified by his employer. Some issues were presented when Remy decided to go in for radio detonators. Those damn things responded to police and FBI frequencies, meaning there would have to be total radio silence for Remy to be able to detonate the explosive at a given time. Normally, he was just lucky, and he swore to himself that he would find other types of detonation. One day, however, he was given a job on the spot, and it had to be done immediately, no preparation. Remy was tasked with placing a small explosive in the office of a rival of his employer. Or a friend, Remy didn't ask. The bomb had planned to kill that target, and only that target. Remy had placed the bomb on the underside of his leather chair in the wee small hours of the morning, before the building was open to staff. The chair had no revolving mechanism, so the small explosive wasn't likely to be seen by the target coming in the morning, or by anybody else. Remy made the rookie mistake of not checking the client's schedule, which he could have obtained if he had had more time. It transpired that the target had an early meeting that day, an emergency one, and that was the meeting that Remy's employer needed to prevent. Why hadn't he placed the explosive under the desk instead of the chair? Why? To make things worse, they were short of chairs in the boardroom, so the target brought his own, and tragically didn't notice the bomb. Upon entering the office hours before, Remy would never have known that he would end so many lives by accident. With a little help. A good deontologist would say I would have stopped at 0 on my murder tally. But Remy Hannington didn't have the luxury of choice back then. He remembered hearing and seeing the explosion when he had witnessed a robbery from his car with blacked out windows, 2 streets down from the target's building. As is custom, the police officer called it in, overpowered the frequency that Remy's radio detonator was set to, setting off the bomb, which was sitting in a room that it wasn't supposed to be sitting in. Although that cop would never know it, never face the consequences of his unknowing actions, he indirectly sent 7 people in that boardroom to their deaths, even though he had no prior involvement. Remy didn't have time to jam the signal himself, so that nothing could transmit. That took a 5-second long jamming program, and all the cop had to do was press down. The voice of the anchor man on Remy's car radio filtered into his consciousness as he ended his trip down a dark lane of his memories.
Reports are coming in of an explosion within the Biocide building in the center of Chicago. Sources say that the main boardroom on the 10th floor of the building exploded during an emergency assembly. No casualty figures have been released as yet, but we will have more on this story as it develops.
Remy remembered switching off that radio, a radio that only he and others like him had access to, knowing he could never bring himself to turn it on again. His employer was still pleased. The meeting had been prevented, and all the participants had been eliminated. It just made Remy's job easier, because his employer would have ended up sending him after the rest anyway. And now, here he sat, in one of his many hiding places, having just returned from one of his many dumping grounds. A dumping ground that was, in a sense, automated. Within a matter of minutes, the second part of his mission would be complete, and he could call for extraction. Chapter 12 Whitehouse Blues Part 1. Doug Harrison liked to roam the halls of the White House after hours. When his wife, the now ex-First Lady of the United States, used to fall into her usual deep dream state, he would do the same. But it was only possible when he was as far away from her as he possibly could be without setting metaphorical or physical alarm bells ringing in the heads of his loved ones, or his full-time security detail's earpieces. He walked by an overblown mirror on his left and stared into it. The man he saw looking back at him was not the man he remembered seeing on national television during the campaign trail. That version of him was a man full of optimism and promise, on the surface anyway. The dark circles around his eyes that he now rubbed at incessantly were a constant reminder of the changes he had undergone during his run as president. What bothered his conscience more than everything else was the fact that the person responsible for his downfall was a free man. He remembered seeing him on TV in the Oval Office one day. He had looked smug. Smug because he knew that the press were on his side. Smug because he knew the law couldn't touch him. And despite the fact that Harrison was the president, the smug man had too many powerful friends, most of them not to be trifled with, in any way. The man on the TV had Harrison over a barrel, and although the man was entirely responsible for Harrison's mental deterioration, Harrison was the one that had to take full responsibility. The secrets and lies that came with politics was something that Harrison thought he could handle upon entering the Oval Office for the first time. But when it entered into his personal life, it took its toll and then some. Sarah, his wife, had also become mentally unstable as a result of the events that had contributed towards the articles of impeachment. He found it difficult to sleep next to her now, and probably would for the rest of the lifespan of their admittedly rocky union, although it was probably over now, and not before time. Xanax was what had put paid to Harrison's sharp mind. The smug man had prescribed it for his wife to counter her stress levels, which were already quite high when Harrison had decided to run. Decided. It wasn't that she didn't believe her husband had it in him. She had no choice. It was because of their daughter. She had gone missing years before Harrison had made the decision to run for president. Since that day, he had worked his way into politics like a snake, because he was always going to run, daughter or no daughter. It was his purpose, what he was made for. So he was told. The line was, he wanted to prove to his wife and to himself that their only daughter's disappearance would not finish him off as a man. At the end of the day, however, even that ended up causing arguments. She would scream at him that he wasn't taking enough time to grieve, even though years had passed, which was true, and that it wasn't giving her a chance to grieve, which was also true. But Harrison had promised his wife that his first action as President of the United States would be to put all points out to find their daughter. The only trouble was, there was more than a 10-year gap between their daughter's disappearance and the swearing in of Doug Harrison. He really underestimated the competition. But he had something that most people did not, and he always would. This obviously meant that by the time he had the power to find his daughter, the already near non-existent trail had gone far colder than he had anticipated. And as a result, Sarah spiraled into an acute form of depression, more so than usual. The press got a hold of the story and dubbed Doug Harrison the worst husband in America, only weeks after the election, and with such a promising campaign. Along with Harrison's senior press officer, John McGovern, he had fought against the story in the form of 5 separate orphan children charity fundraisers. "You have to show the people you care," McGovern had said. Harrison didn't care. He never cared, not about personal things. His projected vision and goals were all that drove him forward. Harrison had never got along with his daughter. She was a hermit who spent most of her time on a computer. She had nothing to do with his political career, and in fact demanded distance from her parents when her father got into politics, 6 months before she disappeared. They had got home one night and found their daughter's room ransacked. What Harrison thought was strange, both now and at the time, was that nothing else had been touched. Nothing. It was as if whoever had broken in, assuming that was the cause, had done so with the express intention of doing harm or worse to their only child. At the time he had been filled with a kind of rage that took over his whole body. Not because his daughter was gone, although that's what he would say if you asked him. He just hated mess. Harrison's wife was a different story. She became inconsolable, would spend all of her time in bed, and had never been sober since. When the charity fundraisers didn't do the trick, both with the public and his wife, he too began to spiral. He started sneaking pills from his wife's stash, hiding them in a false drawer in his office. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't part of the plan. He was supposed to be respected, even feared. But no, he became submissive. Every time things didn't go his way politically or personally, he would pop a pill. He quickly became disillusioned, drowsy, dizzy, forgetful. All things that aren't great character traits when you're supposed to be the most powerful man in the free world. His wife would go to one of the smug man's employees for regular refills, not seeming to notice herself that her medication began to go missing. She must have been too wrapped up in her own nonsense. But the smug man himself did notice, and then proceeded to have regular meetings with the President and the First Lady in the forms of couples counselling, the First Lady confiding in him that things were going off the rails. That was when Harrison had worked it out. The plan. As the man gazed at him across the room in that first session, Harrison knew who that man was. He knew. And he also knew that he was fucked. The drugs seemed to have some sort of false sense of security side effect, and so Harrison increased his illegal doses as the sessions continued, as the smug man broke him down, cracked him open. As time went on, as he lost himself, he began to shrug off documents handed to him by his chief of staff, signing without reading, making important decisions without knowing all, or in some cases, any of the variables. He assumed that his administration would have ironed out all the creases before any of these decisions, usually presented in paper form, even made it into his office. But he was wrong. After a decision to finance a well-known and well-respected medical research facility with billions in order to find a cure for pancreatic cancer, a venture that he knew none of his predecessors would ever entertain, he had basically signed his own death warrant. Death in the public opinion sense, anyway. But the metaphor extended to the thousands that lost their lives as a result of Harrison's signature. And not just people who needed urgent medical care, that the hospitals could no longer accommodate due to strikes and a general drainage of resources, but also people who needed money to live on, who went hungry, who were killed in the riots that sparked as a result of Harrison's bad calls and stupid spending. He had thought that if he found a cure, he would be loved again, and be able to extend that breakthrough to other types of cancer, other types of diseases. He would be loved more than he had been during the campaign, and the short time before all the stories began to break. All that sympathy, all that empathy. But he was wrong. And, worse than that, Harrison was too stupid to realize at the time that the money wasn't going towards a cure for cancer. No, that was almost cliché. The money's true purpose was horrifying, but it was all part of the plan. All part of Mr. Smug's plan. A plan that Harrison had always been a part of, from the beginning. As he broke his long gaze in the mirror, a tear rolled down his left cheek. Yes, he was no longer the President of the United States. His dream had been shattered, and yes, he had lied and backstabbed his way through the White House in order to stay in office. Yes, he had managed to hold on to his marriage. Until now, that is. But at what cost? And the most painful thing of all, his part in this was far from over. The money was just the beginning. Only a necessary prelude that kicked up just the right amount of chaos. The high cost of Doug Harrison's freedom and liberty, the freedom and liberty that he had been promised, was yet to be paid. And the American people, all sleeping soundly in their beds at this very moment, had no way of preparing for the terrors that lay ahead. Chapter 13. Epiphany. Arkham Void's mind traveled back to what he called his wake-up call day. The day he woke up in the middle of an unknown floor, in an unknown place, with no memory of how he had got there. The last memory in his head was that of his mother, back in the day. She always looked as if she was in pain, a pain that she had grown used to, which was the worst kind, the kind of pain that lingered, that clung onto the soul. He sat up slowly and looked around. There was only darkness, and he could smell blood. Wherever he was, he knew it was a place of evil. He shut his eyes, trying to remember how he had got there. But there was nothing. He felt around his position and came across a small flashlight. The handle was wet to the touch, what with he didn't know. But considering the smell that was filtering into his nostrils, he knew that it too was evil. He clicked on the light, his vision blurring slightly as it adjusted. It was taking a while. The floor was bare except for some stains, red stains. His blurred eyes travelled to his own body. He frowned as he realized what he had on. What looked like a bulletproof vest and combat trousers with knee pads attached. His latest memory entered his mind again. He remembered more than his mother. He remembered smiles. Although all he could see were the mouths, not the eyes, the ears, or any other part of the rest of the face. He knew that he was remembering his birthday. There was cake. Which made no sense. Why would a guy celebrating his birthday be wearing bulletproof gear? Had he been paintballing? He knew he was young. He felt young. 18, maybe? He began to wonder if he was dreaming. The blood-stained floor, the strange clothes, total darkness, nothing but happy memories and a basic understanding of life. A clean slate, maybe. A hallucination. A nightmare. But no, this all felt far too real. And he didn't know how he knew that, and the fact remained, he was alone. Arkham thought about calling out, but decided against it. The question entered his head. What if he was supposed to be dead? He might give away his position if he created too much motion and noise. He felt at the back of his head. It was also wet to the touch. Arkham felt pain upon contact, but it was distant, not quite there. Although, because of the clotted blood that he moved around in his fingers as he brought his hands away, shining the light to get a better look, he knew it wasn't too serious. Maybe. The position of the wound seemed like it would have, or should have hurt a lot more than it did. He stood up slowly and shined the flashlight around him. He was in some kind of warehouse. There were shipping containers everywhere. What the hell was happening? He looked up, seeing that there was a hole in one of the skylight windows above. He remembered the noise he had heard as he had brought his body up to a sitting position. A rough, scratching sound. Then he looked down, shining the light on the ground, refocusing on the red stains that coated the floor. He focused more, his blurred vision a distant memory. His first distant memory. And saw the diamond-like shards gleaming in the blood. Shards of glass. He had fallen well over 30 feet from the skylight above. Where was the pain? The fractured bones? Why did the only pain he was currently feeling flow from his head alone? He quickly turned to his left, wincing at the pain that suddenly tore through his skull. He noticed a bright green illuminated exit sign to his left. He made for it without thinking, knowing he needed to get out of here, to at least be able to see himself. He crept out of the door and scanned the area around him. He concentrated on controlling his breathing and noting his body temperature. If he was about to be part of some sort of silent ambush, he had to be prepared. He had to be prepared. The door Arkham stepped through led into a dimly lit corridor, illuminating nothing but the door at the other end, above which an overhead lamp flickered on and off. Where was he? Bizarrely, that wasn't the most pressing question that floated in the front of Arkham's mind. The other question that bathed his heart in metaphorical fire, giving him a physical burning sensation as he began to move slowly towards the sinister overhead lamp. Who was he? He knew he hadn't been captured and hurled into the darkness to die, and he knew his name. That was something. And more. There was a reason for why he was here. His clothes and his weapons represented a life that was far from the last thing he remembered. He felt a dull pain in his right arm. He shined the flashlight to get a closer look. There was a small shard of window glass protruding from his bicep. It had torn through the leather jacket he was wearing over the vest, and there was faint blood running from the wound, staining the jacket. He didn't really notice the pain, nor was he inclined to concentrate on it. Rather, his mind returned to the skylight that he had fallen or maybe jumped through, to escape someone. Something? He paused and rewinded his mind back to the shipping containers. What had he also seen? Construction equipment? Was the building he was in under construction? Renovation? Unfinished. That was the word that replaced the burning question in Arkham's mind. His brain was frazzled. Unfinished made him think of the building. The roof he had fell, or perhaps jumped through, had pieces missing. Unlaid bricks had been piled either side of the exit behind him. But the word wasn't referring to the building. It was referring to something far more important. It was referring to who he was, and what he was. The mission. The mission was incomplete. Suddenly, the darkness, the injuries, and fear from those two things combined no longer mattered. The fear especially took a back seat. It was overtaken by a predatory concentration, ruthlessness, the imperishable instinct of survival that came as an undertone to everything he now knew he was programmed to feel. He wasn't being chased. He wasn't being hunted. He was the hunter. And above all else, he was out to capture or kill, depending on the situation. But as he picked up speed, running through the darkness, like a shadow, tracking, hunting, snarling, he knew it was going to be the latter. Augmented reality training. Online.